Welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Institute Online Lincoln Symposium. My name is Michelle A. Crowell, and I will serve as your host of this series through May 3rd. This live-streamed speaker symposium is focused on the life, times, and legacy of President Abraham Lincoln. You can learn more about the Lincoln Symposium event schedule by visiting the Ford's Theater website at www.fords.org or the Abraham Lincoln Institute website at www.lincoln-institute.org. A note to all our viewers, we are taking your questions on our social media platforms. Later in the program, we will have a Q&A section with today's speakers, moderated by my colleague, Jonathan W. White. Please feel free to submit your questions so that we may share them with the speakers then. Finally, the Abraham Lincoln Institute would like to take this opportunity to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Gary Erskine, Carolina Dulcie, Lauren B.A., Juliana Avery, Andrea Bowman, and the staff of Ford's Theater for all their hard work to make this virtual symposium possible. Our first speaker is Ted Widmer, Distinguished Lecturer at the Macaulay Honors College of the City University of New York, who writes widely on history, politics, and their intersection. In addition to a career as a political advisor, he has directed research centers and libraries, including the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. Dr. Widmer has been particularly active in the realm of public history, and in 2010 he helped to create and became one of the lead contributors to the Disunion series on the Civil War, published in the New York Times. Dr. Widmer's most recent book, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, which follows President-elect Abraham Lincoln on his 1861 train journey from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C., received the 2020 Lincoln Forum Book Prize. Speaking today on Lincoln on the Verge, we welcome Ted Widmer to the program.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks to the Abraham Lincoln Institute, everyone at Ford's Theater. I'm looking forward to talking to Jonathan White later. I admire his scholarship tremendously, and I want to say the same thing about Richard Blackett. So it's really just a thrill to be here with all of you. And Michelle, I have special gratitude to you because on so many occasions you did what it is that you do for Lincoln researchers around the country and around the world. You graciously ushered me into the magnificent Lincoln holdings at the Library of Congress and talked me through what I was thinking about, and then within minutes made these precious materials available. And over again, the Lincoln holdings at the library sustained me. When I hit a dead end, which I often did on my train trip, the train trip I was following with Lincoln, the library was always there and you were always there. So I'm really grateful. And I must say Ford's Theater played a very important role in this story too, although it was one I was not always conscious of. But I've now given a number of talks about this book, which took a pretty long time to write. It took 9 years from start to finish. And I was often asked when my interest in Lincoln began. And I think it began when I was about 10 years old, when my father took me on a train trip. So there's maybe the origin story. And we came into Washington, D.C. Back then, you could take a sleeper car from New England and arrive in the morning. And it was just tremendously dramatic. And I remember literally running out of that train, and I couldn't wait to see all the monuments. And I think I made my poor dad walk up every step of the Washington Monument. And of course, we did the Lincoln Monument, Lincoln Memorial, and Jefferson and the Capitol. And then somewhere near the end of the day, we went to Ford's Theater, and it is one of the great historic sites of Washington, but it really tells a different story. Everything else, especially back then when the Capitol was so open to visitors, was about the accessibility of democracy and the heroism of public service. And going into Ford's Theater, it was a beautifully prepared exhibit, but it was haunting and disturbing. I remember seeing the Derringer on display that killed President Lincoln. And being troubled by it, as I still am all of these years later. So Ford's Theater played a significant role in starting my lifelong thinking about Abraham Lincoln, about the cost of public service as well as the honor and nobility of it. I didn't work on Lincoln as an undergraduate or a grad student. I was both, and I wrote many papers on different topics, but Lincoln was someone I read about for my personal pleasure, and I didn't really treat him as a professional historian. But then, as Michelle mentioned, I went into politics for some time, and all that means is I was a speechwriter in the Clinton White House, and it was impossible not to pay very close attention to the words of Abraham Lincoln. All presidents, Republican and Democratic, revere the linguistic legacy of Abraham Lincoln. It's not just his actions as president or the laws he passed or the constitutional amendments that he wanted to see passed, but the beauty of the language that he used to unite us and remind us of the bonds that hold us together. And that language has perhaps never been more important than it is now, or that is since the Civil War, when we obviously are a pretty divided people. But in a time that was even more divided, the only time I think in our history that was even more divided, we had a genius of unification in our highest office, who over and over again spoke to Americans in words designed to appeal to hearts as well as minds about the values, the sentiments, the memories of older history that tie us all together. So for anyone who goes into speech writing, Lincoln remains really important. And we saw that in the Trump administration, and we're certainly seeing it in the Biden administration, when Lincoln was quoted a couple times in the inaugural address, once quite beautifully with the words following the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, "My whole soul is in it." My intention today is not to speak in a partisan way, and my intention with this book was not to write in a partisan way either. I just wanted to tell a good story. And everything I said up to now was just about how Lincoln was always in the back of my mind, but I would not have called myself a Civil War historian or a Lincoln biographer. But I did have strong feelings about this great writer of our most soaring national truths, and also about the quality of his life and the quality of the example he set as a moral leader for a country that didn't always live up to the standard he was urging us to get up to. And in the long decade after I left speechwriting, I began to write more as an academic about the history of speeches. I edited a 2-volume set in the Library of America about great American speeches. Obviously, Lincoln was very heavily represented in there. And finally, we got to the year 2010, and that was, I don't think people in this Zoom will need to be reminded, but it was the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's election and everything that followed, including the Civil War. And the New York Times, to its credit, decided to do a pretty ambitious online series with daily postings on what happened on this day 150 years ago. And that was the Disunion series, ran for 5 years, and pretty incredible devotion to the subject of Civil War history by a newspaper whose main purpose is to talk about current events. And I was thrilled to be a part of that from the very beginning. And at first I was finding other writers, and then it seemed so fun that I raised my hand and asked if I could write a bit too. And nobody was really following Abraham Lincoln. And that gets at a certain tension that some of you may feel in the academic world anyway, which is that ever since the 1960s, it has been a little bit taboo to write about the top leaders of a country, royalty or presidents, and especially to always write about men or white men or dead white men. And Lincoln was all of the above. But at the same time, I had a feeling that the American people have an inexhaustible curiosity about this man. So I felt the stirrings of a strong desire for the first time in my life to really write a lot about Abraham Lincoln. So this was the door that opened for me. And the New York Times said, sure, why don't you just follow Lincoln? When he does something interesting 150 years ago, just write a little short synopsis. So everything about that was exciting to me, including the style of writing. I'm as capable of writing a kind of swollen academic book as the next person. But this format was so dynamic and moving so fast, and really they only wanted a couple paragraphs every day, that it sort of took me out of my academic self. And I'm really grateful for that. It can be hard to change who you are as a writer, but because this was an online series and a journalistic series, it took me out of myself. And around January of 2011, I was looking ahead to February, and I realized Lincoln was about to take that 13-day train trip. And I asked for permission to do 13 essays, blog essays in a row, and they said, sure. And so for 2 weeks, I killed myself. Every day I wrote about 1,000 words on what happened to Lincoln that day. And by the end of 2 weeks, I had probably written close to half of this book. And then why it took me 9 more years to finish, it's a little hard to answer that, but I think Michelle knows I love research. And so I really went around the libraries of the country, and I don't want to forget to thank the Library of Congress for the Chronicling America database, which is a free database that allows you to read newspapers from cities around the country, and every year newspapers being published. And it's an incredible resource. And I dropped down very deep into that. And so I really had a wonderful time, both the fast beginning over the 13 days in 2011 and then the slow 9 years that followed with all research. And I just felt a great story. When you choose a book, you don't always know if it's going to be a great story. Sometimes halfway through you realize it's not a great story. And with this, it was the opposite. The longer I worked on it, the better the story got. There were all these elements of drama, beginning with the simplest one, which is a man on a train moving fast. And I liked having Lincoln in motion because we think of him in our mind's eye as a photograph or a statue. And obviously he was a human being with dynamic facial characteristics. His mood changed a lot. He would look lighthearted one minute and melancholy the next. And he did move around. He moved around Illinois, and then he moves around the country on his way into Washington. It's also the story of a man growing very quickly as a speaker and a thinker. And he has given very good speeches before the trip starts, but something happens during the train trip, something like the pressure of being on that public stage incessantly, and he really sharpens his message and begins to speak by the end of the trip in a way that I don't think is very far from the extremely high heights of Gettysburg and the second inaugural, heights that no other president has ever really come that close to hitting, in my opinion. And Lincoln begins to talk in that way about the memory of the Declaration of Independence, the higher purposes of our country, why it is so important, not just for Americans, but for all people, for all time, that Americans figure out democracy and especially figure out how to give a sense of political participation to all human beings here, from all racial backgrounds. And so Lincoln is saying really important things, and in a beautiful way. So it's the story of a man figuring out his genius. And finally, it's the story of a man trying not to be killed, because over the course of the trip, it became clear from warnings of spies who were working around Baltimore that there was a very well-developed conspiracy to kill him. And he managed to foil the conspiracy, but not by that much. And if I had some residual sadness from my childhood knowing the end of Lincoln's story in Ford's Theater, I feel like I got to somewhere happy with this project because he narrowly avoided assassination in 1861. And therefore, we got 4 years of Abraham Lincoln, and therefore, we saved our country. He saved it, and we saved it. Everyone involved saved it. We're still in the act of saving it, I'd say, in 2021. But we got Lincoln. We got enough of Lincoln, and that softened the end for me. So this really was a cathartic book in every way. I love these Zooms. I welcome questions from callers, or you can email me on my academic email if you like, because I love talking to the general public, and everything about this book was a joy for me. So why don't I stop my remarks there? We have 5 minutes left for me, and I'll show you. I have 12 slides, which will take you through the story of the book pretty quickly. So this is the first pair of slides, and it shows how unfinished everything was about Washington, D.C. in the transition of 1860 to 61. The Capitol Dome is not finished. This is a photograph from the day of Lincoln's inaugural, March 4th, 1861. And you can just see the construction machinery coming out of the top, the unfinished dome. We can't really see Lincoln in this photograph. It's a blur, as he is so often in photographs from that era. And then on the right is a document in Michelle's stewardship. It's the first inaugural with the famous final paragraph with the brilliant language about the better angels. But even here you can see how much is coming together at the last minute. So Lincoln's story is still evolving, and I wanted to capture in my 13 days a sense that it could literally go off the rails, that he might not make it, or he just might. And these immortal words of the first inaugural, he did survive to deliver them from the east front of the Capitol, but not by that much. Okay, next slide, please. So again, this is from the transition. The photograph on the left is pretty recently discovered or identified photograph. It shows a column being raised. The Capitol has never stopped. It has never been finished. It's always been a work in progress, much like democracy. And in small letters on this photograph to the left, it was recently discovered November 6, 1860. It's the day of Lincoln's election. And again, you just don't know, is that column going up or coming down? And that was the feeling everyone had. On the right, Lincoln, a couple weeks after that day, after his election, you can see a wispy little beard beginning to come in. By far the most dramatic change in appearance of any president between election and assuming office. And that in itself is interesting. That he knew he was in for a mighty struggle. And I think a beard, among other things, I mean, it symbolized certain things, including, I think, sympathy with the young democratic idealists of Europe, but also just a form of armor. He's strengthening himself for the ordeal to come. Okay. I'm so happy that two women play a really important role in this story. I feel like women, they were obviously everywhere in the Civil War. I mean, there were always mothers and sisters and daughters of politicians and soldiers, but they were also playing active roles. The woman on the left is Dorothea Dix, a mental health advocate who traveled through the South. She was from New England, and in her travels discovered the first intelligence of the assassination plot, told the head of a railroad in Philadelphia that was the railroad Lincoln would take through Baltimore and into Washington. He arranged for detectives to come out. Alan Pinkerton was the head of that detective agency, but he brought a woman spy named Kate Warney, or Warren, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And she not only got a lot of the intelligence out of the would-be killers, but then was sent by Pinkerton to intercept Lincoln and his entourage in New York and tell them what they had learned. So she played a very important role. And, they were both deeply in danger at the whole time they were helping Lincoln. So, okay, next slide, please. So here are scenes from the trip. On the left, Lincoln is in New York City at the Astor House, a beautiful hotel on Broadway near what is now City Hall park where Lincoln, as he did throughout the trip, went out and gave brief remarks to a very large crowd. That crowd included Walt Whitman, seeing Lincoln for the very first time, and he fell in love with him from that moment, said he'd never seen a politician who looked the way Lincoln did. And I think Lincoln's body language, his awkwardness, as much as anything, did a lot to endear him to the American people as he made his way through them. On the right is the only photograph that captured Lincoln from the whole trip, a set of 4 photographs from Independence Hall in Philadelphia on the morning of Washington's birthday, when Lincoln had the foresight to join his cause with Washington and the American Revolution and lifted up a big flag over Independence Hall. And even that was a kind of young person's activity. To raise a flag and pull up the ropes was a kind of vigorous thing and made Lincoln look different and younger than Jefferson Davis. And I think he scored a point politically that day coming into Washington. Okay, next slide, please. Frederick Douglass is in Rochester, and Lincoln comes through Rochester. I believe Douglass saw Lincoln on that day. And one thing that struck me halfway through writing the book was that Lincoln is in a way reversing the story of Frederick Douglass. Douglass walks onto a train in Baltimore as a slave, dressed as a sailor. He impersonates a sailor and basically escapes to the north, but very dangerously. And Lincoln is going on a train into a situation of ever-increasing danger, most dangerous for him at Baltimore. So they're sort of doing the opposite trajectories of each other. And later, of course, they, after some mutual suspicion, become allies by 1865. The object on the right is from Ford's Theater, and it's the brass knuckles Allan Pinkerton wore while accompanying Lincoln on the last night of his trip through Baltimore. So there, you couldn't have a better symbol of the danger Lincoln was coming through. And one last set of slides. So on the left is the old depot of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, a little closer to the Capitol than the current Union Station is, but not too far away. And that's where Lincoln came in at dawn on February 23rd, 1861. And once in Washington, he went to the Willard Hotel and he was safe. But the trip through the North, ironically, had exposed him to great danger. And I argue in the book that if he had not survived the train trip, we never, our country would not have survived either. And on the right, you see him looking very serene. That's February 24th, trying to act as if he didn't just come through a terrifying gauntlet, but he did. But he was so smart about his own public relations that he knew that a calm-looking photograph of himself would do a lot to calm the nation, and it did. So when we get to the inaugural, that's when most histories of Lincoln begin. But for me, that's the ending. And I'm just so happy to get him to that point, because that means he has survived and our country has survived. So why don't I leave it there with thanks, and I hope to talk to you all later.
Our second distinguished speaker today is Richard J. Blackett, the Andrew Jackson Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. He previously taught at the University of Pittsburgh, Indiana University, and the University of Houston, and has also served as an editor for the Journal of American History. Professor Blackett's research centers on the abolitionist movement in the United States, particularly its transatlantic connections and the roles African Americans played in the movement to abolish slavery. He is the author of several books on this subject, including Building an Anti-Slavery Wall, Black Americans in the Atlantic Abolitionist Movement, 1830 to 1860, Divided Hearts, Britain and the American Civil War, Making Freedom, The Underground Railroad and the Politics of Slavery, and his most recent book, The Captive's Quest for Freedom, Fugitive Slaves, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, and the Politics of Slavery. And now, to speak on the issue of fugitive slaves and the coming of the Civil War, we are delighted to welcome Richard Blackett to the program.
Thank you. As a historian of antebellum America, I am going to create 2 cardinal sins today. I am not going to mention Abraham Lincoln, and I'm not going to mention Frederick Douglass. Nonetheless, they are two critical players in this period of my address today. I want to start with an eyewitness to strangely many of the fugitive slave cases in his lifetime. And that is Moncur Day Conway, a son of a prominent Virginia slaveholding family who was a student at Dickinson College in 1846 when the local Black community in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, attempted to rescue 3 slaves that were being sent back south. 4 years later, Conway was in Washington, D.C. during the heated debate over the compromise, and particularly the fugitive slave law that was being driven by a fellow Virginian, James Monroe, supported by 2 of the great orators of the period, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Conway was then, later on, 4 years later, a student at Harvard's Divinity School in 1854 when Anthony Burns was dragged back into Virginia slavery under the watchful eye of the military. His owners were men Conway knew. Every step slavery took outside of its habitat, Conway wrote, concluded with a track of blood. His experience led Conway to one conclusion. It was the fugitive slave law that began the war. It is that idea that I wish to explore today. The law did little to stem the tide of escapes. They seemed bent. One Virginia slaveholder lamented as the nation stood on the brink of war on destroying the Union. In the wake of the law's passage, supporters gathered in large numbers in major cities in the North to pledge their allegiance to the law and the compromise. African Americans and their abolitionist allies countered with dozens of meetings in which they expressed open contempt and defiance of the law. Martin Delany of Pittsburgh spoke for many. My house, he made clear, is my castle. If any man approaches that house in search of a slave, and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a resting place, and righteous heaven my spirit. It was no idle threat. Northern Black communities and their abolitionist allies were unwilling to concede what slaveholders saw as their constitutional right to reclaim their escaped slaves. As James Mason had to admit, opponents made reclaiming a fugitive prohibitively expensive, costing in many instances more than the slave was worth. But slaveholders were nothing if not persistent. Days after its passage, slaveholders and their agents came north in search of their escaped slaves. As a result, the battle over the law played out in communities, big and small, throughout the North. In some areas, particularly in the upper reaches of the North, such as the Western Reserve of Ohio, the law was openly defied, and slaveholders dare not insist on its enforcement. When on the eve of the war, a fugitive slave was returned from Cleveland, Joshua Giddings lamented that the citadel of freedom, as he put it, had been breached finally. Southerners, on the other hand, saw the Cleveland rendition as a minor exception, outweighed by what happened at Christiana in 1851, where a slaveholder was killed in a vain attempt to reclaim his slave, and at Syracuse soon after, where a slave was rescued from under the noses of a commissioner. To many in the South, resistance to the law was unmistakable, even if the record showed that in most cases, escapees brought before commissioners were returned. On the face of the evidence, the law was working, but slaveholders' insistence on absolute fealty only worsened political relations between the sections. Successes did not mollify slaveholders. Hearings before commissioners took too long and were too expensive. To make matters worse, there was too much of opposition to the law's enforcement. Slaveholders or their agents had first to persuade local sheriffs to go into Black communities to arrest escapees. Local police were not always willing to risk their necks in communities where they were not welcome. When William Buck sent an agent to Philadelphia in search of William Banks, who had escaped from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia in 1853, he was unsure about his chances of retrieving a slave he acknowledged was very clever. The agent visited many of what he called the receptacles for fugitives. He even tracked Banks to one of the addresses from which he had written letters home, but the fugitive stayed a step ahead of him. He hired a policeman with 15 years' experience tracking fugitives, but it was, as he wrote, like looking for a needle in a haystack, because there were so many places to hide and such varieties of faces, as he put it, that confuse and throw difficulties in the way. In the end, he left empty-handed, insisting it would take several weeks of searching with no guarantee of success. When in the weeks after the passages of the law, slave catchers arrived in Boston in search of William and Ellen Craft, who had engineered a dramatic escape from Georgia 3 years earlier, they initially could not find a sheriff willing to enforce the law. When they finally did, they ran into community opposition that dogged their steps everywhere they went in the city, and a group of lawyers, white lawyers, who pestered them with a series of lawsuits that proved prohibitively expensive. Finally, they left town empty-handed. A series of state laws aimed at impeding renditions reinforced resistance in the streets and courthouses. Some of these personal liberty laws, as they were known, had been in effect prior to 1850. Pennsylvania's laws, for example, was adopted in 1847. Among other things, it banned the use of state prisons to hold accused fugitive slaves awaiting rendition. This was a problem, as there were no federal prisons at the time. What then was a slaveholder to do in the face of a hostile opposition? Supporters of the law in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, found out when, late in the day, in August 1851, after the last train had left town and the commissioner had ordered the return of the escapees. The slaveholder had no other option but to take a room at a local hotel. At night, African Americans gathered outside the hotel, noisily protesting the slaveholder's presence. Sometime during the night, someone set the hotel on fire. The slaveholders and the fugitive barely escaped with their lives. Other northern states, such as Vermont, adopted laws that called for jury trials for anyone accused of being a fugitive from slavery, a direct repudiation of the federal law, and one that guaranteed neither jury trials nor the right of habeas corpus. Such laws were an open affront to the federal authority and the constitutional rights of slaveholders. Such defiance of federal law, for Southerners, a constitutional mandate, tore at the very fabric of the political order. It was clear that in spite of declarations of commitment to the law by both major political parties, there was no resolution in sight. The crises of fugitive slave renditions echoed through the halls of Congress when a crowd of African Americans forced their way into a Boston courthouse in 1851 and freed Shadrach Minkins and sent him to Canada. Henry Clay knew the law was under assault. What irked him more was the realization, as he put it, that the law was being violated by people who possessed, as he put it, no part in our political system. As the crisis came to a head following Harper's Ferry and later the election of Lincoln, there you are, I mentioned him, those seeking a solution to the country's problems returned to the sorts of public meetings reminiscent of those held in 1850. A banner of the Philadelphia meeting called for what the concessions before secession. The meeting, one local editor declared, aimed to do the Union reverence. There were two options available to the North. They must commit the free states to recognize the rights of all and to live in peace with their neighbors by not interfering with the domestic institutions of the South. Northern states must also repeal all legislations of an unconstitutional character, that is, all personal liberty laws. Addressing these concerns, the editor assured his readers would necessitate no humiliating concessions. The meeting agreed. Continued denunciation of slavery had to cease, for it violated the spirit of brotherhood. To Southerners, Northern meetings that brought together the best men, the intelligence and virtuous representatives, a belated one to be sure, of reliable conservative elements who recognized the danger to the nation. One Richmond editor, however, was not persuaded. Such laudable sentiments were outstripped, he declared, by what he called a reeking mass of ignorance and barbarism. Flowery speeches in praise of the things that bound the country together were fine, but the times now demanded action, and that involved enforcing legal and constitutional guarantees and repealing those laws that did not. With that came an attendant right. Slaveholders must be able to move freely about the country with their property. That was only possible if the law was enforced and personal liberty laws, which were meant to impede enforcement of the law, were repealed. It was, one Philadelphia editor believed, simply a matter of what he called fairness and constitutional equity. Achieving fairness, however, was easier said than done. No two people seemed to agree on what was a fair and honorable compromise of the fugitive slave question, one that would command the assent of both free and slave states. Here was an agonizing problem for many Northerners. How could one fulfill one's humanitarian and Christian calling to feed the hungry and care for the stranger without violating state law? One option the New York Times recommended was to compensate slaveholders for the loss of their slaves. Enforcing the fugitive slave law, the editor admitted, was the most embarrassing duty. The South demanded enforcement, and while Northern government agreed the law should be enforced, the people were reluctant to become involved as slave catchers. This was the source of the bitterness between the two sections. On the one hand, slaveholders saw the denial of their property as a violation of their constitutional rights. On the other, attempts to retake a slave nerve what the editor called the heart of brave and sturdy yeomanry to resist the law. There was a need to find common ground, one that would save slaveholders from serious loss and at the same time acknowledge the moral sentiment of those who opposed the return of escaped slaves. This was achievable if fugitives were not returned and slaveholders were compensated for the value of the slaves' loss. It was the only way to heal what he called a chafing and irritating wound. The editor put the cost of such a plan as $1 million annually, much less than the estimated cost of returning runaways. It was a proposal that both recognized what he said, the claim of property on the one hand, and the conscience and humanity of the other. The proposal, not surprisingly, generated heated discussion without getting any closer to a resolution. Who would fit the bill? Southerners asked. Not us, because this was a problem created by a resistance to the law. Those who perpetrated the crime should cover the cost entirely. Such proposals only tinkered at the margins of the problem facing the nation. James Buchanan attempted to address the problem in his final address to Congress. The crisis, he observed, was the result of the long-standing and what he called intemperate interference of the Northern people with the question of slavery of the Southern states. Efforts to exclude slavery from federal territory and the effort to defeat the execution of the fugitive slave law had disrupted the political equilibrium and had kept the country together since its inception. The present dislocation would not have occurred had there not been what he called a constant drumbeat against slavery in the North. Such agitation had also produced a maligned a malignant influence on the slaves and inspired them with vague notions of freedom, and at the same time produce a sense of siege in the South. Secession could only be prevented if the South were left alone to manage their domestic institutions in their own way. He offered a route out of the crisis: repeal all personal liberty laws, recognize the right of property enslaved, protect slavery in federal territories until such time as they entered the Union, when their citizens would decide whether the state would be free or not, and validate the fugitive slave law. It was, as one historian has observed, a proposal of surrender. At a hurriedly convened conference in Washington, D.C., on February 4, 1861, the same day that seceding states met in Montgomery, Alabama to form the Confederacy, James Seddon of Virginia insisted slaveholders should be allowed to transit free states with their slaves and that slavery be protected in the territories. The guarantees were necessary because the Republican administration was in the process of establishing what he called a cordon of free states around the South, so as to extinguish slavery forever. None of these problems would have arisen had northern states controlled the activities of abolitionists operating under the prompting of the British. Nothing came of the conference. Seddon insisted that slavery had been under assault for 25 years, resulted in the election of an anti-slavery president under whose rule their property would be appropriated and blacks elevated to a position of social and political equality. The decision to leave the Union was justified by the North's failure to adhere to the terms of the law and by its adoption of personal liberty laws. In explaining its decision to leave, South Carolina pointed, among other reasons, to the thousands of slaves who were encouraged to leave what they called their homes. Those who did not leave had been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. As William I. Herrick, the Georgia commissioner, put it, the citizens of the South had been deprived of their property and for attempting to seek the redress promised by law had sometimes even lost their liberty and their lives. The Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Law guaranteed the right of return, yet both had been continually nullified and the solemn pledge of the Compromise of 1850 faithfully disregarded. For secessionists, the operation of the Underground Railroad and the failure to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law had come by 1860 to symbolize the North's inability or unwillingness to implement an agreement that many in 1850 saw as the last best chance to preserve the Union. That chance, many Southerners believe, had been squandered. Slaves continued to escape in increasing numbers, aided and abetted by an increasingly active band of emissaries, black and white, who went into the South to entice slaves to escape. These emissaries, one Missourian observed, were, as he put it, thick as maggots on a dead horse. Not a pleasant sight, to be sure, but the image seems to be an apt description of the activities of the Underground Railroad. The records of border state courts showed that these claims were merited. Runaways were aided by other slaves as well as by Southerners, free blacks and whites. Even more troubling was the fact that the law seemed to have had little effect on either the number who escapes or the frequency or size of these escapes. Those seeking freedom slipped away singly, as family units or as groups of co-workers. They had themselves created and sent by rail and steamboat. They commandeered carriages and stole horses. White associates bought them train tickets, or they simply walked away. They procured free passes. Meant as devices to control their movement, the enslaved transformed passes into passports of freedom. To many advocates, the Compromise of 1850 promised to heal political divisions, yet its main feature, the Fugitive Slave Law, unleashed a political crisis from which the country never recovered. Montco Conway seemed to have been correct. My thanks to you all.
Thank you so much to both of you. Those were both wonderful talks. It's great to see you again, Ted, and Richard, it's wonderful to meet you today.
Thank you, Johnson.
Well, I want to remind our audience at home who's watching, you can post questions on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, and they will get sent to me, and I can ask your questions then of our speakers, and they'll be glad to answer them for you. I love how you both brought in figures who are not as well known today, whether it's Moncure Conway or Kate Warne or Warney. I never know how to say her name either. Yeah. And I think it's great to remember the lives of these people who were central to the major issues of the Civil War era. Ted, I want to start by asking you about Kate Warney. How did you come across her story? Can you tell a little bit more about her role working with the Pinkertons?
Yeah, I wish we knew more. There's only one image, and it's not that clear. She died young. Alan Pinkerton buried her in his family plot in Chicago, which is interesting. But for me, that all came from a book called Lincoln and the Baltimore Plot that came out in 1952 and had a long and extensive bibliography, including a lot of the notes kept by Alan Pinkerton, which are in the Huntington Library. And he kept writing out this story in different ways. He was writing it in real time using coded language for his operatives, including Kate Warne. But then he told it, I believe, twice in book form afterwards. And so in the book Lincoln and the Baltimore Plot, I got pretty deeply into the records. They're in an appendix in the back of that book. And I was just kind of amazed that this thriller, it's basically a thriller involving our most famous president, was not better known. It was not entirely unknown, but it was not well known. So I was so happy to do my small part to bring her some attention, but I just wish I could do even more. I wish we had more in her words. There are a few very short documents in which she wrote, Lincoln looked tired. There's so much in that, but you wish she'd gone on in more detail.
Yeah. I've got a children's book about her that I read to my daughters on occasion. And in that book, it said the first time her story ever came out to the public was in her obituary, that prior to that, it hadn't been known publicly. So I didn't even know about these private records of her writing about Lincoln.
Yeah, I mean, even that's true, and also very surprising. I mean, there weren't that many obituaries for women in the 1860s anyway, I don't think. And given the nature of her work, a lot of what she did was secret. But I think Pinkerton really admired her. I mean, who knows? They worked very closely together. But putting her in his family plot was a pretty dramatic thing to do also. So something in their friendship was very important.
Yeah, her obituary appeared in the newspaper that I think was edited by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, which is why they took note of her.
Right.
Yeah. Richard, I was curious, do we have a sense of how enslaved people thought about what they knew of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 or the personal liberty laws? I think of the Grapevine Telegraph that Booker T. Washington wrote about. Do we know how much they knew about these laws and what they were up against? I mean, thinking about how the Fugitive Slave Act really stacked the deck against African Americans who were brought into court, it was a great hurdle to overcome on so many different levels, legal and obviously running away and staying escaped.
No, I don't think they knew much of what was in the details of the law, even if they knew the struggles over the law. These were people who were seeking their freedom, and as such, they took the initiative to leave. And it's in the leaving that they ran up against the law. It is not that the law persuaded them to leave, but in leaving, they ran up against the law, because once they got to a free state, potentially, that's where the conflict between the sections would occur, because there were people in northern communities who were willing to support, to aid them in their escape, and that's where the law begins to clash sectionally. So I don't think the slaves sitting on the eastern shore of Maryland, thinking about freedom and getting away, knew much about the law, or did they say they knew about the law in the evidence? They didn't know about Canada. They didn't know about free states. They did have family members who had preceded them, who had run away, and there were connections between those people in the free states and those they had left behind. So those are the sources of information. Those are the sources that persuade people that it is a good idea to leave. We do know that family members escape serially. The wife would go first, and the husband and children would follow later, or vice versa. Those were the driving forces, rather than the law itself.
Right.
The law was an impediment.
Or sorry, go ahead.
The law was an impediment.
Oh, right. No, I didn't mean to imply that it wasn't. I was just curious if we knew from slave narratives after the fact how much enslaved people were aware of either the law itself or the personal liberty laws. Can you tell the audience just about some of the more egregious aspects of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, just so that they have a sense of the burden of proof the hurdles that accused fugitives had to go over in court when they couldn't even testify on their own behalf?
Yes, that's one of the things. The accused couldn't testify.
Yeah.
The hearing had to be expeditious, as short as possible. All the slaveholder or the slaveholder's agent had to do was prove that the person standing before the commissioner was the person in the advertisement that he held up in his hand. And that was the burden of proof that was necessary. But the fugitive slave law violated basic fundamental principles of jurisprudence. It denied habeas corpus. It denied trial by jury. It denied the person the right to testify in his own defense. So potentially that meant, and this is one of the aspects of this thing that we need to keep close attention, it means that a free black who is accused of being a fugitive has no defense.
Right.
And that free black, if he or she were always free, had no documents to prove their freedom. So the person couldn't whip out their free paper and say, here's my free paper. So they simply were at the mercy of the law. The law also had another effect on the communities in the North, in that it required people, if asked, to assist the sheriff to capture a fugitive slave. Mm-hmm. So that if you're a white person in Philadelphia, for instance, you don't even have any concern about slavery. Just let's assume, you're not an abolitionist. You're just an ordinary Joe in the street. And some sheriff says to you, you got to help me to capture this person. It's turning you into a slave catcher, whether you like it or not. And there's a penalty for saying no. And the penalty is substantial.
Yeah. Well, and in the case of the Christiana riot, which you mentioned during your remarks, when Cassner Hanway is deputized and he refuses to go after the fugitive slaves, they try him for treason against the United States.
Yep. The largest treason trial in the history of the United States.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Yeah. It wasn't just Hanway, it was all those people who had gathered to see what was going on.
Yeah, I think among the defendants were more than 30 African Americans.
Yep, yeah, they just threw a blanket over whoever was there, and they dragged them into court and tried them for treason.
Yeah, and the one other aspect of the law that comes to mind is that if the commissioner who's presiding over the case finds the person to be not a slave, the commissioner gets paid $5 for the case. If he finds him to be guilty, he gets paid $10, and it just stacks the deck against the accused.
That's called a bribe.
Yeah.
Although the defenders of the law justify it, they say it takes more paperwork to send somebody back.
Yeah, right. It's unbelievable.
Yes.
Well, Ted, we got a question in for you. One of the viewers said you mentioned how Lincoln looked youthful compared to Jefferson Davis in 1861. Could you speak more about the different public images that Lincoln and Davis cultivated in this period as the Civil War is about to begin?
Well, they couldn't have been more different in almost every way. Lincoln is a near total unknown commodity. He has been a one-term congressman and not a successful congressman. His supporters in Illinois basically recalled him for, among other things, his embarrassing criticism of a very popular war, the Mexican War. So his political career is over 12 years earlier, and he still has a successful career as a lawyer, but he's not really a national figure, and he loses. Some people know about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but that was a regional election for Senate that he lost. He lost all the time. Davis has a glittering resume. He's been a war hero, unlike Lincoln. He's a war hero in Mexico. So Lincoln is bad on Mexico. Davis is good, according to what most people thought then. Then he is Secretary of War, so he's an important cabinet official. He's very close with the presidents. He's especially close with Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, so he has northern friends, but certainly a lot of southern friends. And he's a senator from Mississippi and a leader of a cabal of senators, and gives flowery speeches on the floor of the Senate up to and including his resignation. So he's really a national figure. And he has all this military experience. So everyone expects that his leadership of the Confederacy will be formidable because he will be very hard to defeat on the field of battle. And Lincoln hasn't commanded anything except he's a very young man. He has brief militia service in the Black Hawk War.
Fighting mosquitoes in that case.
Right, exactly. In that speech he made making fun of his own service, which even that shows how different they are, because Davis is so serious, and you never see a photograph of him smiling. He's a severe man. But on this 13-day trip, Lincoln's humanity began to win over a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people who were looking at him very skeptically liked what they saw and heard. And they saw a young man, he just turned 52, pretty young, shaking tens of thousands of hands. So it's so many hands, his hand ached, telling small jokes from the back of the train, but also saying important truths, including, in his way, Lincoln was in trouble to his left as well as to his right. And when he got into the Western Reserve, there were many people who felt he wasn't abolitionist enough. But by the time he got to Philadelphia, he's invoking the Declaration of Independence as a document whose promise includes all people. That's the word "all" is in the Declaration, and Lincoln is giving us his interpretation. That's what it means, all people. And one of the more astonishing moments of my research was going to Richard's story. I discovered that Independence Hall, our most important shrine to the American Revolution and to our documents, had become a holding pen for fugitive slaves or accused fugitive slaves awaiting trial. And as you both said, the trial usually just sent them back. So our most sacred building was a jail for usually unlawfully captured free people of color who were then sent back not very far to Maryland and Delaware. Yeah,
and Independence Hall is where the Christiana riot treason trial takes place as well. So, Richard, I want to go back to you with a question from an audience member. Can you talk about the ways that the Black community in the North tried to protect and hide escaping slaves as they're making their way out of the South into the North and possibly on their way to Canada? How do they go about doing that?
That's a good question. And it's good because it's hard to answer. We know not from their successes, but from their failures. So in failing to protect somebody, the issue comes to court, and it is there that we begin to see some of the methods that were employed to defend escaping slaves who were going through particular communities. But the defense centered around the Black communities. And those Black communities were places where the police tended not to go. And those places also had places that could hide and protect those people who were running away. So that is one of the mechanisms that they use. They also were quick to rally the community to defend somebody if they suspected there were slave catchers about. So one of the first things that we see in the weeks after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law are the appearance of flyers that are posted throughout the cities that say, "Ha, there's a slave catcher about, be careful." And they describe the slave catchers. He always had flaxen hair, lanky, he was an ugly man. Those were the kinds of words that we use. But it pinpointed the individuals, it alerted the community. So when the slave catchers, for instance, and I mentioned that in the piece, when the slave catchers appeared in Boston, the Black community was ready for them. And they simply intimidated them with the help of white lawyers who were supportive. They tailed them everywhere they went. They congregated outside their hotels at night and tried to keep them awake. Anytime the slaveholder was walking on the street, possibly carrying a knife, the lawyers charged them with the possession of weapons, and that meant they had to face bail. So there was something like 5 cases that were brought against the couple of slave catchers that came to get the crafts. And in the end, they were just simply intimidated to leave. So that gives us some idea of the way the community organized. And there were individuals that, for instance, when the crafts were under assault from the catchers, the husband and wife were separated. One stayed in Boston in the Black community. The wife, Ellen, went off to outside in Brookline. And at that home where William Craft was being held, kegs of dynamite were put under the house. And the police were told that kegs of dynamite were put under their house. And the slave catchers were told, and in order to intimidate them not to do it. So there were different ways that they also collected a considerable amount of money that they used to move people about. And there were always carriages ready to take people on different routes out of the place.
Am I remembering correctly? Are the Crafts the couple where the wife dressed the husband up?
No, the wife dressed as she was phenotypically white. She was phenotypically white, so she dressed as a slaveholder, and her husband accompanied her as a slave. She was going for ostensibly for medical treatment in Philadelphia. Right.
Wow. I remember reading about that in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's diary. I think he met them at some point when they were in Cambridge or in Boston.
Yes, they were quite the celebrities. So that within 2 weeks of the passage of the law, their Georgia slaveholder sent slave catchers after them because they had become such a symbol of abolitionists undermining of the slave system that they had to be silenced. And in the end, they were forced to leave Boston, and they settled in England. They lived in England for 19 years.
Wow. Ted, we got a question about the plot to assassinate Lincoln in Baltimore. Can you tell us how Lincoln responded to that plot? What were his feelings? And I'm thinking of some of the speeches he gave as well at Independence Hall, how maybe that was on his mind.
Well, thank you. That's the best way to answer it. It's on the morning he comes to Independence Hall, Washington's birthday. He talks about how every political sentiment he's ever felt has come from the Declaration of Independence, written in the same room, and how if he ever has to surrender those principles, he'd rather be assassinated on the plot on that spot. And it's an incredible moment of drama, because he has just been told the night before of the severity of the real plot against his life, and they haven't figured out what to do yet. They're improvising. And later that same day, he goes out to Harrisburg, and Pinkerton has figured out this plan by which Lincoln will get on a secret train and come through Baltimore in the middle of the night. And he survived, but even his survival was not great, because a false story was circulated. It began in the New York Times, which was usually a pro-Lincoln newspaper, but a reporter who was mad that he had been left out of the story created a false story, or, like a lot of stories, there were elements of truth to it, but a lot of it was false. Said that Lincoln had put on a Scottish outfit, which was absolutely not true. And that was all anyone needed to know to make fun of Lincoln at a moment when people weren't sure whether to take him seriously or not anyway. So that story did a lot of political damage to him. But he did survive. And in a serenade just a couple days after he got to Washington, he said, I got to this city under circumstances that were different from anybody who ever came here before. And it wasn't much, but it's a little hint that he knew he'd come through an incredible adventure. And I use that actually as the opening quote of the whole book. But then about 3 years later, he gave an interview, and he briefly mentioned it, and he sort of dismissed it as not a very serious thing. But I think he must have known it was he kept Allan Pinkerton around and kept relying on him for other needs. And he promoted all the people who helped to save his life, the people in his entourage. There's a guy named Norman Judd, who's a political friend from Illinois, gets promoted. So I think Lincoln knew some brave people had saved his life, but he also knew that politically he needed to make everything seem as calm as possible. And that's another way, the last question, how is he different from Davis? Davis was pretty conceited, and it was always about Davis. As it turned out, he was a pretty bad military leader, and Lincoln is the humblest. He understood what his talents were, but he never talked about himself in a speech, and he didn't want his drama to interfere with the importance of saving the Union. So I think he soft pedaled the story just to calm everything down after the fact.
I think that's a great assessment. And for viewers at home, you can Google this moment, and there's a political cartoon that appeared, I think, right around this time, that shows Lincoln wearing a Scotch cap, sort of sneaking through Baltimore. And it was not true, but yeah.
Right.
Or go ahead.
He had a slightly different hat than he usually wore, and he had a slightly different coat, but his face was exposed. He wasn't hiding in a disguise. He just had a slightly different hat, although he did say it made him look pretty different.
Yeah. The journalist who made up that story, I think, was Howard.
Right. Joseph Howard.
Joseph Howard. And Howard winds up in 1864 trying to strike it rich by making up a fraudulent draft proclamation, and winds up in jail at presidential orders. So maybe Lincoln got his revenge 3 years later.
There's a new book called Lincoln's Lie by Elizabeth Mitchell. It tells that story. She's a friend of mine. So
good.
Thank you for mentioning it.
But that disguise is so common throughout, because isn't Jefferson Davis caught wearing a woman's dress? Or at least that's what they said.
No, it's funny.
There's always something about this guy.
It's almost the same thing. He's running away, and his wife her shawl. She just gave him something to keep him warm. And I think he had the shawl on his shoulder, but he didn't have a dress on.
Well, I think she put the shawl over his head. It was on around May 10th, 65. The Union soldiers are coming in at Irwinville, Georgia. And she apparently said something like, "Oh, this is my mother, and she's afraid of the commotion. Can I take her away?" And, the Union soldiers saw the heel spurs and the boots and said, "Those aren't the boots of a woman." And then Northern printmakers have a field day. I actually have a print right over my shoulder of Jefferson Davis dressed in drag from that moment. And there must be 36 prints of Davis dressed as a woman trying to escape. So it is funny how these leaders get depicted in different ways. So there are similarities in the images.
Yeah, you're right. Yep.
Richard, we got a question from a viewer about freedom suits. Can you talk a little bit about the freedom suits that enslaved people tried to use to gain their freedom either before or after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850?
I don't think the Fugitive Slave Act had any effect on people suing for their freedom. That was something that had been going on decades. That is both slaves and to some extent free blacks who had been enslaved illegally used the courts in an effort to gain their freedom. And those suits occurred throughout the South, even in deep southern states. So freedom suits are critical, and there have been a number of works that have looked at freedom suits, but the two things are not related.
Yeah, I think that's right. A lot of times people get confused and think the Dred Scott case is about the Fugitive Slave Act, and it's not. It was a freedom suit.
Yeah, a freedom suit with a lot of political implications.
That's right. Richard, I want to ask another question about, and it touches back on some things you'd mentioned earlier. Can you talk about the problem of kidnapping that free African Americans in the North had to face in the 1850s? I mean, obviously it's in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. It's a problem that they had to face.
It's a problem that and it's particularly acute in those adjoining lower northern states and those counties that abut southern states. That free blacks, particularly children, were very vulnerable to being kidnapped and sold into slavery. There were people who had been freed and subsequently then kidnapped and taken back into slavery and then sold into the South. So that's a serious problem for free blacks. As I mentioned, those who did not have free papers are particularly vulnerable. If I were an emancipated slave, I had papers, and I could show, if challenged, that I am emancipated. But for those who did not, they're open to all sorts of shenanigans and all sorts of illegal activity. And some people have argued that it was the volume of kidnappings were large enough that they were a sort of reverse underground railroad.
Right.
People were taken out of, and you have groups of people. There's a character called Alberti in Philadelphia who is notorious. He has connections in Maryland. He knows if he gets his co-workers in Maryland. He identifies a free black in Philadelphia. He sends the descriptions to those guys in the South. Those guys then claim that the person is a fugitive slave, sent back to Alberti in Philadelphia, and that becomes the grounds on which people are kidnapped and taken south. So no, that is a serious problem, and it's something that has been explored in the literature, but we don't know all the details because many of these people never returned. Right. They just disappeared into slavery. There's one famous case in Cincinnati that a nice book has just been written about, in which the woman is captured after she was liberated and taken across into Kentucky and sold to Natchez. And then that person, the slaveholder, in an attempt to evade Union forces, takes her to Texas, where she remained a slave. And after the war, she returns and she discovers that the person who imprisoned her in Kentucky was in Cincinnati at the horse races, and she sued him in court.
Wow.
And it is the one case that we know, Henrietta Ward is the name we know, Wood. We know the one case where she claimed, she sued him for a large amount of money, $20,000 or something like that, and got $2,000. But it is the one case that we have of somebody who got some kind of reparations for being enslaved illegally.
Right, because Solomon Northup, of course, is famous and tried to sue and was not successful.
He got absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time. I wish we could go on for another hour. I have so many questions I would love to ask you both, but we'll have to do that on another occasion. I want to thank both of you for your wonderful presentations. I want to thank the staff at Ford's for hosting this event and for making this possible. And I want to let all the viewers at home know that we've got 2 more of these coming up in the next few weeks. The next one will be on April 19th. It'll be same time, 4 p.m. Eastern time. We will have Lucas Morel, who will talk about his new book on Lincoln and the Founders. And we will have Mark Steiner talk about Abraham Lincoln, colonization, and Black citizenship. And I do want to commend the books of these 2 speakers to our audience. Ted Widmer's Lincoln on the Verge. And Richard, I don't have your latest book here, but I do have Making Freedom. And so to those of you at home, thanks again for joining. Please pick up and check out our speakers' books. And I hope to see you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks. And we can't wait for your book too, Jonathan.
Oh, thanks.